What if I told you one of the most famous men in Hollywood didn't just step away? He disappeared. No farewell, no clear explanation, no real closure. And the more people look into it, the less it makes sense. Because Jim Carrey didn't fade away like most celebrities. He said things. He questioned things. And then he was gone. Jim Carrey's absence from this year's Oscars didn't just go unnoticed. It ignited a quiet storm of curiosity almost instantly. Viewers around the world felt it. Something was off. One of Hollywood's most iconic, unpredictable, and magnetic figures was simply missing. No appearance, no statement, no explanation. And in an industry where presence is everything, silence like that doesn't go ignored. Then, just as the questions began to build, an even stranger detail resurfaced, one that pushed the mystery into far more unsettling territory. A performer known as Alexis Stone had previously claimed that he once appeared as Jim Carrey's body double at the César Awards in France. Not a parody, not a tribute, a convincing replacement, the kind that could pass unnoticed in a room full of cameras and celebrities. That revelation didn't answer anything, it made everything more complicated. Because it led to a chilling question that refuses to go away. If someone else could step in and convincingly appear as Jim Carrey, then where was the real Jim Carrey? And for some, the answer may be far darker than anyone is comfortable admitting. It has been a long time since the world truly heard from Jim Carrey in the way it once did. Not just interviews or appearances, but that unmistakable presence, that voice that once cut through Hollywood's illusion with humor and truth. Over time, he didn't just step back, he seemed to drift away. His silence grew louder, his distance became noticeable, and the image he left behind only became more mysterious with every passing year. Naturally, speculation began to grow. Now, comedian Katt Williams has stepped forward once again, offering a perspective that has only intensified the conversation. According to him, what we see on the surface of Hollywood is only a fraction of what actually exists. Beneath the red carpets, beneath the flashing cameras, beneath the carefully controlled narratives, there may be something much deeper, much darker. He argues that the entertainment industry isn't just competitive, and it isn't just corrupt in the way people casually assume. Instead, he suggests that there are forces operating behind the scenes, forces with influence far beyond fame or money. Forces that shape careers, control narratives, and decide who rises and who quietly disappears. And if even a fraction of that is true, then Jim Carrey's absence might not be as simple as stepping away. It might be something else entirely. That idea becomes even more unsettling when you truly stop and listen, not just to what is being said, but to what is being implied beneath the surface. There's a recurring theme, almost whispered between the lines, that disappearing is never as simple as it looks. From the outside, it may seem like someone has chosen to step away, to retreat, to take a break from the spotlight. But what if that's only part of the story? Because sometimes disappearance isn't about escape, it's about survival. Sometimes it's about stepping away from something you can't openly confront. Sometimes it's about doing work that no one else can see, the kind of work that happens in silence, inner work, shadow work. The kind of emotional, psychological, even spiritual effort required to endure pressures that the public will never fully understand. Pressures that don't exist on stage or on camera, but behind closed doors in private conversations, in moments that are never recorded. And that's where the thought becomes truly chilling. Because it suggests that some people don't vanish because they want peace. They vanish because they are fighting battles no one else can see. Katt Williams has spent years speaking about what he believes is a deeply rooted culture of control, oppression, and enforced silence within Hollywood. Not as a theory, but as a pattern he claims has repeated itself over and over again. According to him, the moment someone begins to question the system too openly, the moment they expose uncomfortable truths or refuse to follow the unspoken rules, that's when things begin to change for them. Careers stall, opportunities disappear, reputations shift, and in some cases, the person themselves seems to slowly fade from public view. Not always dramatically, not always overnight, but gradually, quietly, almost as if they're being erased in real time. And for many fans watching from the outside, Jim Carrey appears to fit that pattern in a way that's hard to ignore. Because for years, Carrey was never just another actor. He wasn't just a comedian delivering performances, he was someone who seemed to see through the performance itself. He openly challenged the it of celebrity, often ridiculing the very system that had elevated him to global fame. He spoke about illusion, about identity, about the artificial layers that Hollywood builds around people and sells as reality. He questioned everything from the meaning of success to the structures of power that operate behind the scenes. He hinted at hidden forces, criticized the lack of authenticity, and openly mocked the machinery that transforms real human beings into carefully controlled symbols. To some, that made him fearless, a rare voice willing to speak honestly in an industry built on image. But to others, that kind of honesty isn't admirable. It's dangerous. Because in a system built on illusion, the most threatening thing isn't failure. It's truth. And then, there were moments when it felt as though Hollywood didn't just listen, it responded. Not loudly, not directly, but in subtle, almost calculated ways. One of those moments came during an awards segment connected to Jim Carrey's series Kidding. What should have been a routine celebratory appearance quickly turned into something far more uncomfortable. The exchange was awkward, abrupt, almost dismissive. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary mishap, the kind of strange moment live television sometimes produces. But if you watch closely, it didn't feel accidental. It felt pointed. Jim Carrey, however, didn't react the way most people would. There was no visible frustration, no attempt to push back or correct the situation. Instead, he smiled. He leaned into it. He played along as if the entire thing was part of a larger performance. To the audience, it came across as classic Carrey, effortlessly turning discomfort into comedy. But beneath that composure, something lingered. Because moments like that don't just disappear, they accumulate. They become part of a larger narrative, a pattern, a quiet tension between an individual and the system surrounding them. And for those paying attention, it raised an uncomfortable question. Was Hollywood simply laughing with Jim Carrey or subtly reminding him of the limits he wasn't supposed to cross? That question didn't come out of nowhere. In fact, the seeds of that suspicion had been planted years earlier, during one of the most unforgettable moments of his career. At the 2016 Golden Globes, Jim Carrey took the stage and delivered a speech that at first sounded like harmless humor, but quickly revealed itself to be something much deeper. Instead of offering the usual polished, predictable gratitude, he did something unexpected. He dismantled the moment itself. Standing there in front of Hollywood's elite, he introduced himself not once, but repeatedly as two-time Golden Globe winner Jim Carrey. He said it again and again, exaggerating the phrase until it became impossible to take seriously. What started as a joke slowly transformed into something sharper, almost uncomfortable in its honesty. The audience laughed, of course. Cameras cut to familiar faces. Denzel Washington smiled, clearly entertained. On the surface, everything appeared normal. It was Jim Carrey doing what Jim Carrey does best, being eccentric, unpredictable, effortlessly funny. But if you listened closely, there was something else underneath the laughter. Something intentional. Because he wasn't just mocking himself, he was exposing the entire performance surrounding him. The titles, the prestige, the illusion of importance. He was holding it all up to the light and quietly asking, what does any of this actually mean? His message, though delivered through humor, was strikingly clear. Inside Hollywood, these awards are treated like symbols of greatness, proof of success, markers of legacy. But when you zoom out, when you step beyond the walls of that world and look at the vastness of existence itself, they shrink. They become small, almost insignificant, almost absurd. And in that moment, Jim Carrey wasn't just entertaining the room. He was challenging it. He was questioning the very ritual everyone else had come to celebrate. And whether people realized it or not, that kind of honesty doesn't always come without consequences. And Hollywood has never been particularly comfortable with people who speak that kind of truth, especially when they say it out loud, in front of everyone. Because quiet doubt can be ignored. But public clarity, that's different. That's dangerous. And that is exactly why so many viewers have started connecting Jim Carrey's story to the warnings Katt Williams has been repeating for years. It forces a question that is difficult to shake once it enters your mind. What actually happens when someone reaches the very peak of the industry, when they have the fame, the money, the influence, and then turns around and tells the world that it's all empty? What happens when one of the most recognizable faces on the planet begins to dismantle the very idea of identity itself? Because that's what made Jim Carrey different. He didn't just criticize Hollywood from the outside, he questioned it from within. He suggested that the person people admire, the version of him the world celebrates, might not even be real, that it's a construct, a character, a carefully performed illusion designed to be consumed. In other words, the mask is not the person. And once you say something like that publicly, there's no easy way to take it back. For some people, this transformation in Jim Carrey was something extraordinary. They saw it as a genuine awakening, a rare moment where someone who had everything finally realized it wasn't enough. He spoke openly about searching for meaning beyond success, beyond recognition, beyond the endless cycle of validation. He referenced spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle, explored ideas of ego and consciousness, and often reflected on detachment from identity itself. To those who followed that journey, Jim Carrey wasn't breaking down. He was breaking free. He was stepping outside the illusion and trying to show others what he had seen. But not everyone interpreted it that way. Others looked at the same shift and saw something far more unsettling. They noticed how openly he began criticizing Hollywood itself, how he mocked award shows, rejected the idea of icons, and refused to participate in the mythology that had once elevated him. They saw a man who no longer played by the rules, and in an industry built on unspoken rules that doesn't go unnoticed. In their eyes, Jim Carrey didn't just change. He crossed a line that separates those who quietly succeed within the system from those who begin to question it out loud. And according to what Katt Williams has been suggesting for years, that line is where everything changes. Because once you cross it, you're no longer just part of the industry. You become a problem for it. Katt Williams has said this more than once, and each time it lands a little heavier. According to him, the moment someone inside the entertainment machine begins to speak too openly, the machine doesn't ignore them. It reacts. Not always loudly, not always immediately, but deliberately. First it isolates, then it pressures, and if that doesn't work, it erases. Careers begin to stall without explanation. Opportunities quietly disappear, public perception shifts, and over time, the person who once stood at the center of everything seems to drift further and further away from it, until one day they're no longer part of the conversation at all. And for those who believe that pattern is real, Jim Carrey's absence doesn't feel random. It feels familiar. It feels like something they've seen before. That belief has led many to look beyond Carrey's story and toward others who have tried, in their own ways, to expose what they claim exists behind the surface of Hollywood. One name that repeatedly comes up in that conversation is Corey Feldman. For years, Feldman has spoken publicly about his experiences as a child actor, experiences he describes not as glamorous, but as deeply traumatic. He has consistently pointed to what he believes is a culture of silence within the industry, a system that, in his view, protected abusers while leaving victims isolated, unheard, and often discredited. He didn't describe it as a single incident. He described it as an environment where fear becomes normal, where confusion and shock are part of daily life, where a child can go through something unthinkable and still feel like there is nowhere safe to turn, because the people who are supposed to protect you either don't see what's happening or choose not to see it. And what makes his story even more unsettling is that he never spoke about it as something that simply ended. To Feldman, it didn't belong in the past. It lingered. It followed him. It remained an open wound, one that never fully closed. He has repeatedly insisted that what he experienced wasn't isolated, that it wasn't rare, and that it certainly wasn't unknown. According to him, many people were aware of what was happening. Some even heard the stories firsthand, and yet nothing changed. The individuals he believes were responsible, he says, continued to rise. They remained powerful, influential, protected, untouchable. And that brings us back to the most difficult part of his message, the part that continues to echo long after it's said. Because again and again, Feldman returns to the same devastating conclusion. In Hollywood, the people who speak out are often the ones who lose everything. Their credibility is questioned, their character is attacked, their voices are drowned out. While those with money, power, and an entire system behind them simply move on as if nothing ever happened. And once you start seeing that pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. That same pattern didn't stop with one voice. It echoed. It resurfaced in different forms through different people, each one describing something that felt disturbingly similar, even if the details varied. Elijah Wood, known to millions for his role in The Lord of the Rings, spoke about the industry in a way that caught many off guard. He didn't tell a single shocking story or name specific individuals. Instead, what he described was something quieter, but in many ways more unsettling. A system, an atmosphere, a way of operating that, once you notice it, becomes difficult to unsee. Wood suggested that within Hollywood, there are individuals who do not view innocence with care or responsibility, but with opportunity, with appetite. He spoke about environments where vulnerability is not protected but exploited, where young, ambitious individuals often stepping into the industry for the first time can become targets for those who understand exactly how power works and how to use it without consequence. What made his words carry even more weight was the balance in what he said. He made it clear that he personally avoided many of these situations, largely because his mother remained closely involved in his life and career. That protection mattered. It created a barrier that many others may not have had. But even with that protection, he still saw enough to know the danger was real. And perhaps most importantly, he never suggested that it was something confined to the past. If anything, he implied the opposite. That those dark paths didn't simply disappear. They adapted, they continued, they remained just beneath the surface, hidden in plain sight. When you begin to place these voices side by side, Corey Feldman, Elijah Wood, and others who have spoken in fragments, in hints, in carefully chosen words, a larger picture starts to form. Not a confirmed map, not a proven system, but something that feels eerily consistent. A pattern, not because every detail has been verified, but because the structure itself feels familiar. A structure where power is concentrated, where silence is encouraged, where fear quietly exists in the background, and where speaking too openly can come with consequences that extend far beyond a single career. And once that pattern takes shape in your mind, it becomes harder to dismiss. Then came Rose McGowan, and her description didn't soften the conversation. It intensified it, because she didn't speak in hints or careful implications. She spoke directly, bluntly. She didn't describe Hollywood as simply flawed or unfair or even corrupt in the way people often assume. She called it something far more controlled. She called it a cult. In her view, Hollywood wasn't just an industry, it was a system built on rules that were never written down, yet somehow understood by everyone inside it. A world where expectations aren't explained, they're absorbed, learned through observation, reinforced through experience, and enforced through consequence. When she entered the industry as a teenager, she said she realized very quickly that success wasn't just about talent. It was about compliance, about how you looked, how you behaved, how desirable you were perceived to be, and how willing you were to follow rules that no one would ever officially acknowledge, but everyone seemed to obey. Because in that kind of system, you don't need to be told what to do. You just need to see what happens to those who don't. She described being told, sometimes directly, sometimes through subtle signals, that if the right people didn't find you appealing, your opportunities could vanish just as quickly as they appeared. Not gradually, not fairly, just gone. And the most unsettling part, it was never presented as a rule. No one handed you a list, no one explained it openly. There was no official policy, no written guideline you could point to and challenge. Instead, it was framed as something much more powerful. Reality. An unspoken understanding that everyone inside the system seemed to accept without question. And perhaps that is exactly what makes a system like that so effective, because when rules are invisible, they become harder to resist. You can't argue with them, you can't expose them. You can only learn them or suffer the consequences of not understanding them in time. The walls don't need to have rules written on them, because the system enforces them anyway. And as more voices began to question that system, more stories, more patterns, more uncomfortable observations, another name kept surfacing in the conversation. Dave Chappelle, a figure who, in many ways, represents something rare in Hollywood. For years, Chappelle has been seen not just as a comedian, but as someone willing to draw a line and stand by it. Someone who understands the system, but refuses to fully submit to it. And nothing represents that more clearly than the moment he walked away at the very peak of his success. At the height of Chappelle's show, when his influence was undeniable and his future seemed limitless, he made a decision that stunned the entire industry. He walked away, not from failure, from everything, from the spotlight, from the momentum, from a deal that at the time was reported to be worth around $50 million, a number so large that most people couldn't even imagine turning it down, let alone actually doing it. And yet he did. Almost overnight, the narrative shifted. Some called him brave, others called him unstable. Some said he had seen something, others said he had simply lost his way. But for those paying closer attention, the story felt deeper than that. Katt Williams has been one of the loudest voices insisting that what happened with Chappelle was not fully understood by the public. According to him, the decision wasn't just about money, it was about something far more important. Integrity. The kind of integrity that becomes incredibly difficult to hold on to when everything around you is designed to make you let it go. And that is exactly why the story continues to resonate. Because in an industry where people are often expected to exchange their values for access, where silence can be rewarded and compliance can be profitable, Dave Chappelle appeared to do something almost unthinkable. He said no, not quietly, not reluctantly, but decisively. He turned away from the machine at the exact moment it was offering him everything most people spend their entire lives chasing. And that kind of decision doesn't just stand out. It echoes. One of the reasons that story carried so much weight was because it didn't come out of nowhere. Dave Chappelle had already been hinting at something deeper long before he walked away. In a widely discussed interview, he shared a moment that on the surface seemed small, almost trivial, a comedic scene. a costume, a simple request to wear a dress for a joke. In most cases, it would have passed without a second thought. But for Chappelle, something about it didn't sit right. And he said no. What made that moment powerful wasn't just the refusal, it was why he refused. He made it clear that his objection had nothing to do with comedy itself. He wasn't rejecting humor, he wasn't being difficult. What he was rejecting was the feeling that he was being subtly pushed, shaped, maneuvered into doing something he didn't believe in. Something that didn't feel like his choice. And then came the pressure. Not all at once, but in layers. First the writers, then the directors, then the producers. Each one approaching from a different angle, using different reasoning, different persuasion, different urgency. The full machinery of production slowly closing in, not aggressively but persistently. Nudging, framing, normalizing, turning something he resisted into something that was supposed to feel inevitable. All of it for a moment he didn't even believe was necessary. And that's what made his story resonate so deeply. Because it revealed something most people never see. The pressure doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like consensus. It looks like everyone around you agreeing that something is normal, until your refusal begins to look like the problem. Until you begin to look like the obstacle. Chappelle's message was quiet but unmistakable. Once enough people agree on something, resistance doesn't feel like strength anymore. It feels like defiance. And in environments like that, boundaries don't just exist on their own. They have to be defended, held, protected. And not everyone is able or willing to do that when everything around them is pushing in the opposite direction. For many viewers, that single story became something much larger than a behind-the-scenes anecdote. It became a symbol, a glimpse into how influence works in Hollywood, not through commands, but through pressure, through normalization, through the slow erosion of choice. But the conversation didn't end there. Because years later, another voice entered the discussion, and what she said added an entirely new layer of complexity. Singer and industry whistleblower Jaguar Wright began raising questions that made even longtime observers pause. According to her, resisting the system doesn't always mean escaping it. Sometimes it just means delaying it. She argued that even those who once stood against the machine can eventually be pulled back into it, reshaped by it, influenced by it, or quietly absorbed into its structure. In her view, something about Dave Chappelle's more recent work feels different from the voice people once admired. Less raw, less rebellious, more aligned. She suggested that at a certain level of success, where money, influence, and global platforms intersect, rebellion itself can be transformed, packaged, redirected, turned into something that still looks bold on the surface but no longer threatens the system underneath. In other words, even resistance can be controlled. Even truth can be softened. And if that idea is true, then it raises a far more unsettling question than anything before it. Not just who is controlled, but whether anyone at that level can remain completely free. Whether people agree with he or not, Jaguar Wright's words did something important. They shifted the conversation because they introduced a possibility that is far more unsettling than simple corruption, a possibility that lingers long after the discussion ends. What if resisting the system isn't always enough? What if strength, talent, and even conviction can eventually be worn down? What if some people aren't just silenced, but pressured, negotiated with, gradually reshaped? What if, over time, the very system they once stood against begins to change them from the inside? Bought off, exhausted, or simply transformed? That idea alone is enough to make anyone pause. But beyond that point, the conversation takes an even darker turn. Because this is where it stops being just about influence, careers, and control, and begins to move into something far more disturbing. Something harder to explain, harder to prove, but impossible to ignore once you hear it. Some former insiders, people who claim to have moved within the highest levels of the entertainment world, have described private Hollywood gatherings in ways that feel almost surreal. Not as glamorous celebrity parties filled with music and excess, but as carefully controlled environments that feel orchestrated. Almost ritualistic. One former publicist, someone who had direct access to high-profile circles, described experiences that didn't resemble anything the public typically imagines. According to him, these exclusive events often came with strict conditions. Guests were required to sign non-disclosure agreements before entering, legal barriers designed to ensure silence. Phones were taken away at the door, removing any possibility of recording, documenting, or exposing what might take place inside. In that kind of environment, he suggested, people behave differently. Because there are no cameras, no witnesses, no consequences, at least not in the way the outside world understands them. What he described inside those spaces was even more unsettling. Atmospheres that felt deliberately constructed, lighting that seemed intentional rather than decorative, music that didn't feel celebratory but symbolic, settings that didn't resemble casual gatherings but something far more controlled, almost theatrical. As if everything happening had a purpose beyond entertainment. As if it was being performed for reasons not immediately obvious. One particular gathering in New York stood out in his memory. He described it as carrying a dark, almost ritualistic energy, something that didn't feel accidental or spontaneous. But what disturbed him most wasn't just what happened inside. It was where it happened. Because these events weren't hidden deep in remote, inaccessible locations, far removed from society. They were in plain sight. Right there in the city. Close to busy streets, close to ordinary life. Close enough that you could look out a window and see people going about their day, completely unaware of what might be unfolding just beyond their view. That contrast is what made it feel unreal. The idea that something so strange, so controlled, so secretive could exist just steps away from normal life without anyone noticing. Or perhaps without anyone saying anything. And that leads to an even more unsettling realization. If what he described was real, then it wasn't hidden in the traditional sense. It wasn't buried underground or locked away behind impossible barriers. It was hidden socially, protected by power, shielded by wealth, and sustained by silence from those who participated and from those who chose not to look too closely. What he described next was even more unsettling. According to his account, at one point during the gathering, a group of women was brought into the room quietly, almost as if it were part of a routine no one needed to explain. They weren't introduced in any formal way. There was no context, no explanation. They were simply presented. And something about it immediately felt wrong. He said the women didn't appear relaxed or comfortable. There was a noticeable tension in their posture, in the way they looked around the room, in the way they avoided conversation. When people tried to engage with them, their responses were minimal, guarded, almost rehearsed. It wasn't the energy of a party. It wasn't the behavior of people freely choosing to be there. It felt controlled. Now, to be clear, he admitted that he did not witness any specific crime. He didn't claim to have direct proof of what was happening behind the scenes, but what he did describe was enough to leave a lasting impression, one that didn't sit right, even long after the night had ended. Because sometimes it's not what you see directly. It's what you feel when something doesn't add up. He recalled sitting beside one of the women and trying in a simple and human way to make conversation. Nothing intrusive, just basic questions. Who are you? What do you do? Do you have social media? The kind of small talk one might use to break the ice in an unfamiliar setting. But the answers never came. Not really. According to him, she avoided giving any real information. Her responses were vague, distant, carefully limited. She seemed nervous, almost as if she was aware that saying the wrong thing could have consequences. There was a barrier there, not just hesitation, but restraint. As if she couldn't speak freely. And then, just as suddenly as they had arrived, they were gone. A staff member entered the room. The women stood up, no explanation, no farewell, just quiet movement. They were led out one by one, as though they had completed whatever role they were brought in for. The room shifted, but no one reacted. The guests stayed a little longer, the atmosphere continuing as if nothing unusual had occurred. And then, eventually, they too were escorted out, guided back through a completely ordinary exit. A grocery store. Bright lights, shelves, everyday life continuing just outside the walls of what he had just experienced. The contrast was almost surreal. One moment, a controlled and unsettling environment hidden beneath the surface, and the next, the normal world untouched, unaware. As if none of it had happened. But for him, it didn't end there. Because memories like that don't fade easily. He said that later, during the quiet isolation of the pandemic, his mind kept returning to that night. Over and over again, replaying it, analyzing it, trying to make sense of what he had seen and, more importantly, what he hadn't been able to fully understand in the moment. And the more he thought about it, the darker it became. Because when you strip away the setting, the luxury, the status, the surface-level distractions, what remained didn't feel like a party at all. It felt like a process, a system. In his mind, it began to resemble something far more disturbing. The movement of people not as individuals but as commodities, brought in, observed, chosen, rotated, removed. Not treated as people, but as products. And once that realization takes hold, it's not something you can easily forget. Whether someone chooses to believe these accounts completely, approach them with caution, or dismiss them with skepticism, they all seem to point toward the same underlying fear. A fear that goes far beyond individual stories. Because at its core, it raises a question about power itself. What happens when wealth and influence reach a level so high that they begin to create spaces where normal rules no longer apply? Spaces where accountability fades, where consequences become negotiable, where the boundaries that exist for everyone else quietly disappear. That idea alone is enough to unsettle anyone. And in many ways, that is what brings this entire story full circle. Because when you step back and place all of these voices side by side, when you look at them not as isolated claims, but as fragments of a larger pattern, something begins to take shape. Katt Williams speaking about control and silence. Jim Carrey questioning identity, fame, and illusion from within the system itself. Corey Feldman describing a culture where victims feel powerless and unheard. Elijah Wood hinting at environments where vulnerability can be exploited. Rose McGowan calling the industry a system governed by invisible rules. Dave Chappelle walking away at the height of success rather than compromise. Jaguar Wright suggesting that even resistance can eventually be absorbed and reshaped. And then the former insiders, describing private spaces that feel controlled, secretive, and far removed from what the public imagines. Individually, each voice can be debated. But together, they form something much harder to ignore. A narrative, not of Hollywood as we're told it is, but of Hollywood as a system. A system built not just on creativity and entertainment, but on power. A system that knows how to reward obedience and elevate those who play their role perfectly. A system that can quietly punish defiance, not always with confrontation, but with absence, with silence, with disappearance. A system that can take something imperfect and make it appear beautiful. And perhaps most unsettling of all, a system where silence itself becomes a form of currency. Something traded, something protected, something that, once you understand its value, becomes very difficult to break. And that is exactly why Jim Carrey's Disappearance continues to linger in people's minds. Not because everyone agrees on what happened to him. Not because every theory can be proven. But because his absence fits, almost too perfectly, into a pattern that more and more people are beginning to question. Because Jim Carrey wasn't just another celebrity who faded away. He was different. He was one of the very few who stood at the center of the spotlight and dared to laugh at it, to challenge it, to expose it, while still being a part of it. He didn't just play the game, he questioned the rules while the game was still being played. He peeled back the layers of fame. He stripped the glamour away from celebrity. And he spoke in a way that made it sound like he had seen behind the curtain, and what he found there wasn't impressive. It was empty, or maybe something worse. And once someone says that out loud, once someone at that level begins to question the illusion itself, it changes how people see everything that comes after. Because suddenly, his silence doesn't feel random. It feels significant. And that brings us to the question that refuses to go away. The question that keeps pulling people deeper into this mystery, no matter how many times it's dismissed, debated, or ignored. Why do so many voices who challenge Hollywood seem to fade from the spotlight? Why do they fall into controversy, get labeled, get pushed aside, or simply disappear from the center of power altogether? What really happens behind the scenes when someone refuses to play the role that's been written for them? And if there truly are deeper systems operating beneath the polished surface of entertainment? Then who built those systems? Who protects them? And more importantly, who is actually brave enough to expose them? These aren't simple questions. They're not comfortable. They don't come with easy answers. But once they take hold in your mind, they become impossible to ignore. And maybe that's the most important part of all. Because sometimes the truth doesn't start with answers. It starts with questions that refuse to go away. So now I'll leave it to you. What do you think is really happening behind the curtain? And if you've made it this far, I want you to do one thing. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think all of this is coincidence, or do you believe there's something much bigger happening behind the scenes? And if you want more deep dives like this, stories that challenge what we think we know, make sure you subscribe and stay with us. Because this is only the beginning. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think this is all just coincidence? Or do you believe something much bigger is happening behind the scenes? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want more content like this, stories that go beyond the surface and make you question everything, make sure you subscribe, because this is only the beginning.